Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green, and this is a contextualized reading for Book 14, The Loyal Swineherd of Homer's Odyssey, for our ongoing course on Homer and the critique of Western civilization. So Athena has transformed Odysseus into beggar's clothes, and he shows up with the to the swineherd's door here. And we know, as I noted in the last contextualized reading, what we've seen is that Odysseus is playing for a long time the part of the stranger, and this is a theme of the king who has become completely the beggar, right? Later on, though we don't really get it in this context, it's a later image. This will show up as Fortune's wheel, right, or Fortuna, which is regarded as a wheel in later thinkers like Boethius. But so we get a deep description of the swineherd's place, right? So this is something that we've been set up for. Is usually there's this grandness of the palaces, but we get a detailed description of the swineherd's place and how the boars have been reduced in number, right? By now they were down to 360 head. That's still a lot. Like they've been reduced to that. So this says something about how wealthy Odysseus is, right? But guarding them all the time were dogs like savage beasts. A pack of 4 reared by the swineherd, 4 men of men. The man himself was fitting sandals to his feet, carving away at an ox hide dark and supple. As for his men, 3 were off with their pigs, herding them here or there. Under orders, he sent a 4th to town, with a hog in tow for the gorging suitors to slaughter off and glut themselves with pork. So we get this image that this opens, and it's very much this pastoral image, right? I mean, these are the beginnings of pastoral poetry almost. And we could look at, maybe in another course or something, look at like Homeric odes and other poetry of this time period. But we know at least the aesthetics of this kind of sweet country rustic life are already with us in this text from about 750-ish or 700 years before current era ish. So then the dogs run off to chasing. If anybody's maybe had this kind of encounter in their own life, that if you've gone out to the country, the dogs go running off to attack Odysseus, and they're going to do him harm, but then the swineherd yells at them and says, "Lucky to be alive, old man. A moment more my pack would have torn you limb from limb. Then you'd have covered me with shame, as if the gods had never given me blows and groans aplenty. Here I sit, my heart aching, broken for him, my master, my great king, fattening up his own hogs for other men to eat, while he, starving for food, I wager, wanders the earth, a beggar, adrift in strangers' cities, foreign-speaking lands, if he's still alive, that is, still sees the rising sun. Come, follow me into my place, old man, so you at least can eat your fill of bread and wine. Then you can tell me where you're from and all the pains you've weathered." And so we get, a little bit, this is like the loving, the adoring servant here. But nevertheless, he is the servant, and that's something I want to emphasize repeatedly throughout this course. And, is the narrator trustable here? How much our servants love their masters here? At least that's the way the story figures it. And one thing that's very, very interesting, and this will happen throughout the next few books, is the narrator here, the narrative voice, starts addressing Umass, that's the swineherd's name, in the second person. And that makes the telling of the tale, the narrator, into whom? right? Well, it seems to be either someone who's very intimate with the entire situation and can see what's going on, so like something like a god or the muse, or the narrator becomes Odysseus himself. We already know that Odysseus is a great teller of tales with the Phaeacians, right? And now he's returned to his land and he's going to be telling lots of tales. He lies, he's crafty, but there is a loving kind of tender tone that the text takes and addresses Umass in the second person. And we know that Umass, swineherd that he is, poor as he immediately follows the laws of Xenia, the laws of Zeus, right? And my host, may Zeus and the other gods give you your heart's desire for the royal welcome you've shown me here, says Odysseus. And the text says, and you replied, Umass, loyal swineherd, it is wrong, my friend, to send any stranger packing, even one who arrives in worse shape than you. Every stranger and beggar comes from Zeus, and whatever scrap they get from the likes of us, they'll find it welcome. That's the best we can do, we servants, always cowed by our high and mighty masters, especially our young lords. And I want to pause here for the people who want to be the defenders of this idea of Western civilization. If Xenia is this powerful, right? If it is the root of our society, why do we have the kinds of homeless problems that we have in our current society, right? Why do we have people who don't want to take care of the homeless people? It does not seem to be that we might idealize this kind of custom of taking care of strangers, but that doesn't seem to actually occur in real life. Nor does it, as we'll see, with refugees, with nationalism, with problems at the borders, putting people in cages. Recently, concentration camps on the southern borders of the United States in recent years, and people who want to say that that the penning up of people on the border of the southern United States isn't some form of concentration camps, like what was happening in, say, Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And then you have over 400 scholars of the Holocaust come and sign a collective letter that says that is indeed what is happening on the southern border of the United States. Maybe they're not being carted off to be taken to the, quote, showers and killed en masse, but that is not how it started with the Nazis either, right? So I want to really, really call people's attention to the contradictions and to the hypocrisy of people who want to defend a notion of Western civilization and how great it can be with what actually happens, right? And if there is so much progress, which is often a defense that there's less overall death in the world today, with all of our technology, with all of our progress, why do we have the human conditions that we have in our daily life? Something to think about. And we get this servant's commentary here, this lowly servant. So I think that we could take this, maybe we could read into Homer that this is a kind of cultural critique from the narrator's voice, which I don't feel like is that's not the way I'm reading it. I'm not getting a sort of notion of critique, but I am getting a notion of the way that things should be. Seems to be what this epic is telling us. But then, right after this very generous move on the swineherd's part, he immediately curses Helen, right? My master, I tell you, would have repaid me well if he'd grown old right here, but now he's dead. If only Helen and all her kind had died out too. brought to her knees, just as she cut the legs from under the troops of men. My king among them, he went off to the stallion land of Troy to fight the Trojans, save Agamemnon's honor. I noticed online, and maybe in some of my later lectures I'll come back to this. I noticed with some of the recent racial theory and some classic scholars who've been reading race in this text have sort of brought up the question that women are treated with such fury in this text at moments, that women seem to be racialized as their own caste of people, and here the swineherd can say if they could all be done away with, right? Which also shows that he has this bachelor status. He doesn't have any kind of use for women either. So enough. He brusquely cinched his belt around his shirt, strode out to the pens, crammed with droves of pigs, picked out 2, bundled them and slaughtered them both, singed them down, sliced them down, skewered them through, and roasting all to a turn set them before Odysseus. So just in a few lines, it's like whole pigs get slaughtered, and then they're all of a sudden on the table. And then we get a long diatribe from the swineherd where we get his view of the gods, and I think this is such a really great moment of the text where we're getting this lower class person's perspective. It's not often in the text that we get the view of worldly life from the servant's perspective. Eat up now, my friend, it's all we slaves have got. Scrawny pork while the suitors eat the fatted hogs. No fear of the gods in their hard hearts, no mercy. Trust me, the blessed gods have no love for crime. They honor justice, honor the decent acts of men, even cutthroat bandits who raid foreign parts, and Zeus grants them a healthy share of plunder, ships filled to the brim, and back they head for home. Even their dark hearts are stalked by the dread of vengeance. But the suitors know they've caught some God-sent rumor of master's grisly death. That's why they have no mind to do the courting or fairly, or to go back home in peace. No, at their royal ease they devour all his goods. Those brazen rascals never spare a scrap. Not a day or a night goes by, sent down by Zeus, but they butcher victims, never stopping at 1 or 2, and drain his wine as if there's no tomorrow, swilling the last drop. Believe me, my master's wealth was vast. No other prince on earth could match his riches, not the loamy mainland or here at home in Ithaca. No 20 men in the world could equal his great treasures. Let me count them off for you. And then he goes on to this listing. And Odysseus replies in this wily way where he asks about himself again, right? And so, friend, who was the man who bought you with his goods, the master of such vast riches? So he is a slave, right? So the slave is the text is just very clear on this. This is a slave who loves his master, apparently, at least according to the narrator. You tell me he died defending Agamemnon's honor. What's his name? I just might know such a man. Zeus would know, and other deathless gods, if I ever saw him. If I bring you any news, I've roamed the whole earth over. Old friend, no wanderer landing here with news of him is likely to win his wife and dear son over. Random drifters hungry for bed and board lie through their teeth in the swallow back on the truth. So like now we see that there's this critique, there's this suspicious mind that shows up with the swineherd too. People are liars, people are swindlers. They try to pose as beggars for seeking hospitality just to get a meal, right? But then again, that we switch back to like never another master as kind as he. I'll never find one, no matter where I go. Not even if I went back to my mother and father, the house where I was born and my parents reared me once. Ah, but much as I grieve for them, much as I long to lay my eyes on them, set foot on that old soil, it's longing for him that wrings my heart, Odysseus, lost and gone. Master, brother, he says a few lines later. So the text is very clear in the sense that it sets up the servant as accepting his lot in life as a slave and even loving his master. My friend, the great Odysseus, long in exile, answered, since you are dead certain, since you still insist he's never coming back, still the soul of denial, I won't simply say it. On my oath, I swear, Odysseus is on his way. He says, I hate that reward for such good news. Let me have it the moment he sets foot on his own house. Dress me in a shirt and a cloak and handsome clothes. Before then, poor as I am, I wouldn't take a thing. I hate that man like the very gates of death who, ground down by poverty, stoops to peddling lies. I swear by Zeus, the first of all the gods, by this table of hospitality here, my host, by Odysseus' hearth, where I have come for help, all will come to pass, I swear, exactly as I say. And the swineherd greets this with disbelief. So we've seen that kind of shifting back and forth again and again. And then we get some news about Telemachus here as well. The heart inside me, says Umass, breaks when anyone mentions my dear master. That oath of yours will let it pass. Odysseus, oh, come back, just as I wish. I am Penelope, old Laertes to Telemachus too, the godlike boy. How I grieve for him now. I can't stop. Odysseus' son Telemachus. The gods reared him up like a fine young tree, and I often said, in the ranks of men he'll match his father, his own dear father, amazing in build and looks, that boy. And so this back and forth, and we see that Odysseus is getting news. And then they finish eating, and it's Odysseus' turn to tell his story. And he tells a false story. He says, unlike my mother, she was a slave, a concubine he purchased. He's the son of a lord, right? That comes from Crete, a rich man's son. But his mother was a slave. He'd purchased, yes, but he's treated me on par with all his true sons, Castor, Hylix's son. And so this is something that I maybe mentioned, I'm sure I mentioned it in an earlier contextualized reading, that we can look back historically, and that the Law of Xenia in the 5th century BC in Athens was that there's some contestation about the Law of Xenia because Athenian citizens were marrying foreigners and or having children with foreign women and then trying to get citizenship for their sons. So there's some drama and controversy that comes a few hundred years after this. But in this text, anyway, we see that there's at least the recognition of bastardy, the illegitimate son, and that at least in this case, in Odysseus' story, if we can believe it, he's treated well. But that implies that bastards were not always treated well, which also implies something about ideas about monogamy and patrilineal transference of power as well. And he tells a story about how good he was in battle. Such I was was I in battle true, but I had no love for working the land, the chores of households either, the labor that raises crops of shining children. No, it was always o'er-swept ships that thrilled my heart, and wars, and the long-polished spears and arrows, dreadful gear that makes the man cringe. I loved them all. God planted that love inside me. Each man delights in the work that suits him best. So he goes off, he tells the story, he's gone off with the Achaeans, and he goes to the Trojan War. And so this is how he's kind of slyly, Odysseus is slyly letting the swineherd know that he might have some sort of knowledge of Odysseus. And he tells about Priam's city, or the Trojan War here. And then his traveling afterwards, 5 days out, and we raised the great river Nile, and there in the Nile delta moored our ships of war. God knows I ordered my trusty crews to stand by just where they were and guard the anchored fleet, and I sent the patrol to scout things round from higher ground. But swept away by their own reckless fury, the crew went berserk. They promptly began to plunder the lush Egyptian farms, dragged off the women at once, killed the men, dragged off the women and children, killed the men. Outcries reached the city, stirred by shouts, and the entire town came after them. And so in this wild tale that Odysseus is telling, the men have gone and they've unjustly perhaps started pillaging and doing what, in other cases in this text, Odysseus has definitely shown up and leveled cities, right? And so there's some knowledge of that coming back, but Odysseus got away with it. But in this tale, the men don't get away with it, and he's the good guy. He was off, paying homage, and so he begins fighting, but he knows that they're not going to win, and so he tears off his shield, and he runs up to the king and embraces the king for this Law of Xenia again, right? And the troops want to kill him. They have javelins pointed at him, but the king honors the Law of Xenia, right? Honors the stranger. Then he says, when the months and days had run their course and the year wheeled round at last, the seasons came again, he conned me aboard his freighter bound for Libya. He lives in Egypt for a year, and then a Phoenician scoundrel tricks him on board a ship, and then pretending I'd help him with a cargo there for sale, but in fact he'd sell me and make a killing. Right, so he thinks he's going to get to go home, but he doesn't get to go home. Instead, he gets put on the Phoenician ship, and then they're going to sell him, but then the ship encounters, partly because the ship has, of course, broken the trust of giving this stranger safe passage. The ship is punished, and so all the crew members die, but then Odysseus is able to get away, or Odysseus in this lying story. He says, the god cut short their journey home forever, but not mine. Zeus himself, when I was just at the final gasp, thrust the huge mast of my dark proud vessel right into my arms, so I might flee disaster one more time. And then it's there, he goes to the king of Thesprotia, and then where he says he's gotten his first word of Odysseus. The king told me that he'd hosted the man in style, befriended him on his way home to his native land, and showed me all the treasure Odysseus had amassed, this bronze and gold and plenty of wrought iron. But Odysseus, he says, he had made clear, was off at Dodona then to hear the will of Zeus that rustles forth from the gods. And so always there's this doubling, this kind of alignment with Zeus, and that Zeus is looking out for Odysseus, whether it's Odysseus in disguise or not. Always the Law of Xenia is being invoked and being honored by some, and when not honored by others, there's some sort of justice that's meted out. Except for the fact that, like the Phaeacians were good on their honor, but they were too good on their honor, right? And so they pissed off Poseidon, and so there's revenge that can come from the gods, even from doing too much good. And so we see that there's a kind of parallel going on with the Phaeacians here, around lines 408. And you replied, Umass, loyal swineherd, so much misery, friend, you moved my heart deeply with your long tale, such blows, such roving, but one part's off the mark. I know you'll never persuade me what you say about Odysseus. A man in your condition, who are you, I ask you, to lie for no good reason? Well, I know the truth of my good lord's return, how the gods detested him with a vengeance, never letting him go under, fighting the Trojans or die in the arms of loved ones, once he'd wound down the long coil of war. Then all united Achaea would have raised his tomb, and he'd have won his son great fame for years to come. But now the whirlwinds have ripped him away, no fame for him, and here I live here, cut off from the world and from my pigs. I never go to town, unless perhaps wise Penelope calls me back. And so he goes on, and he says he's heard other things about Odysseus and therefore doesn't believe this tale. So there is this suspicion and disbelief that creeps in. And there is a parallel here going on with the Phaeacians again. So you old misery, seeing as God has led you here to me, don't try to charm me now. Don't spellbind me with lies. Never for all that will I respect you, treat you kindly. No, it's my fear of Zeus, the god of guests. And so there's a mix-up, like yes, Odysseus is telling this wondrous story, like he told with the Phaeacians, but he's getting a little bit of a different result and definitely suspicion from the swineherd. But that doesn't mean that the swineherd throws him out. And so we get a critique, this is a gentle critique of the swineherd's suspicion here. Good God, what a dark, suspicious heart you have inside you, says Odysseus. Not even my oath can win you over or make you see the light. Come, strike a bargain. All the gods of Olympus witness now our pact. And then he swears this stronger oath. And the swineherd honors it. Surely, friend, and just think of the praise and fame I'd win among mankind, now and all for time to come, if first I took you under my roof, I treated you kindly as my guest, and then cut you down, robbed you of your life. How keen I'd be to say my prayers to Zeus. But it's just high time for a meal. I hope that the men will come home any moment, and that we'll taste supper in our leisure. So he doesn't quite believe him. Umass doesn't quite believe him, but he also says it would be even worse if I invited you into my house and then treated you badly, right? Then I would be the bad guy. And then we get the swineherds of the other men come home, and we get a detailed pig slaughter. The swineherd, soul of virtue, right? So virtue here, the text tells us that even though that he's a lower class person, that there's something virtuous about him, and he's been suspicious, right? He's been unable to believe all of the things that his guest has told him. He began the rite by plucking tufts from the porker's head, threw them into the fire, and prayed to all the powers. And then he does this. The text says his sense of fairness is perfect, as he honors everybody, and Odysseus is just watching on as this servant does everything perfectly. You replied in kind, Umass, swineherd. So again, that direct address to the swineherd. Eat, my strange new friend. Enjoy it now. It's all we have to offer. As for Father Zeus, one thing he will give and another he'll hold back, whatever his pleasure. All things are in his power. He burned the choice parts, so we get a more detailing here. And then, even though the text has been praising, the narrator has been praising Umass, Odysseus then goes on to test him. He keeps testing Umass, keen to test the swineherd. Would he take off his cloak off and hand it to his guest? And so he says, "Listen, Umass, and all you comrades here, allow me to sing my praises for a moment. Say it's the wine that leads me on, the wild wine that sets the wisest man to sing at the top of his lungs, laugh like a fool. It drives the man to dancing. It even tempts him to blurt out stories better never told. But now that I'm sounding off, I can't hold back. Oh, make me young again and the strength inside me. Steady as a rock." There's this little invocation, right? It's like a mini invocation of the opening of the entire book itself. And make me young again, just steady as a rock, just as that I was that day when we sprang the sudden ambush against the Trojans. Odysseus led the raid with Atreus' son Menelaus. I was third in command, and they'd chosen me themselves. And so we get this telling this long tale of the Trojan War. And then we get Umass' response again. "You replied, Umass, loyal swineherd. Now that was a fine yarn you told, old-timer. Not without a point, not without a profit either." The tale he's told, of course, is a tale of being naked without a cloak, right? And he's in Odysseus's troop, and at first he goes to Odysseus, and Odysseus says, "Shh," and then Odysseus sends one of the men off to go running, and that man has to leave his heavy cloak behind, and so Odysseus has, in his wily way, given a cloak to the naked man. And Umass understands the story to be told is like that he's asking for warmth too. You won't want for clothes or whatever else is due a worn-out traveler come for help, not for tonight at least. Tomorrow morning you'll have to flap around in rags again. Here we've got no store of shirts and cloaks, no changes. Just one wrap per man, that's all. But he pulls over an extra cloak used for winter and gives it to the guest. And so the test has been, just how far will the law of hospitality be extended? And Umass never disappoints. He flung on his guest the heavy flaring cloak he kept in reserve to wear when winter brought some wild storm. So here Odysseus slept, and the young hands slept beside him, not the swineherd, not his style to bed indoors, apart from his pigs. He girded up to go outside, and it warmed Odysseus's heart. Umass cared so much for his absent master's goods. First over his broad shoulders he slung the whetted sword, wrapped himself in the cloak, and stitched tight to block the wind, and adding a cape, the pelt of shaggy, well-fed goat. He took a good sharp lance to fight off men and dogs. Then he went out to sleep where his white-tusked boars had settled down for the night, just under a jutting crag that broke the north wind's blast. There is this rustic kind of pastoralness that's, I think, being glorified as we see Umass go off. And we might look at the ideology of the text here. Is this the ideology of an epic that tells us as lower class people that we should love our masters, that we should do our duty, that that's what virtue is taking good care of our master's goods when the master is gone, and doing it out of love and out of respect, and also having attention to Zeus's laws of hospitality as well to such a great extent. There is a glory, nevertheless, that the text puts onto the character of Umass for being so loyal as a servant. And his loyalty will continue in the next books, but that's the end of this one. So we will carry on to book 15, which wherein we return to Telemachus's story. As always, if you can support us on Patreon, that would be really helpful. But if not, no worries. We will carry on with another contextualized reading at another time. Have a great night, day, morning, wherever you're at. Thanks for watching and listening.